Good. This is good. I'm just going to take a moment since I have the floor to say thank you so much, Alan, for doing this for us. And I'm thanking you from the curriculum committee and from the board and from, you know, everybody in the class. We cannot fall over ourselves enough to tell you how much we've appreciated the time and effort you put into this. So can we all clap? What happens if we clap? 1, 2, 3. You hear it? Clap. We normally come up with a pretty little gift bag, and I suppose I could have had one of those to hold up. But then where do we go? So gift bags, this term seemed to be coming across the internet with coupons and gift certificates and things. So we can't thank you enough, and we know that, you know, there's no way to repay you. So thank you.
And that is one of the things I personally love best about Spark, is that it is almost entirely volunteer run. All of our instructors do this because they love the topic that they are talking about, and they want to share their knowledge with you. And so, as Judy said, we are just now starting to think about fall. And so if there's something that you love, that you would love to share your knowledge about, please reach out to Judy and let her know, because we need instructors.
Okay, and thanks, Laurie, and Judy, thanks much for those good words. It's a lot of fun, and having active participation by many of the people in the class who ask questions, make comments, and so on, really helps make it worthwhile. So thanks to all of you too. Okay, where were we? Today, of course, is the last class, and you know, predictably, we're not going to get anywhere near 1815, the technical cutting off time of the class. We'll get as far as we can and lead into, well, we'll end up hopefully talking a little bit about the Canadian Indians, our first excursion north into what's now Canada. But last week we finished up with the arrival of the Puritans and the people like Squanto, who had helped make the Puritans and before them the Pilgrims feel that they were indeed being welcomed by God, which had cleared the countryside for them and left enough helpful local native people to definitely help the Pilgrims get going. Okay, so we're talking for a few minutes now about the native people who were actually in the area when the Pilgrims and the Puritans turned up. And remember, the Pilgrims, 1620, turned up in what's now Plymouth, this being Plymouth Harbor here. And 10 years later, in 1630, the Puritans turned up in Massachusetts Bay, from which the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was taken, and which in turn had been named after the Massachusetts tribe, which had inhabited that area, the area north of Plymouth, south of Plymouth, going down into what's now Rhode Island, the Wampanoag people, and out here on Cape Cod and enjoying life around the Kennedy compound and out on Martha's Vineyard, the Nauset people. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims, same really, they're both Puritans, both groups of Puritans with some significant to them theological differences, less significant to us. But in any case, the Wampanoags were the people that the Pilgrims met in and around Plymouth. They lived in Wetus, which are sometimes known as wigwams. They lived in these Wetis, or wigwams. They're sachems, and we'll be talking more about sachems in a few minutes. Sachems are what we've often thought of as chiefs. Were usually men, a few occasionally were women. Unlike Western tribal chiefs, the sachems were chosen not so much for skill in battle and for impressive oratory, but for administrative skill, and they ruled by consensus. The Wetus themselves were grouped in villages, villages usually surrounded by defensive palisades, such as in this period illustration. There was a good deal of back and forth tribal warfare in the period. And they raised corn in village gardens. And back now at the maize and cotton North America map that we've seen before, we're getting towards the northern limits of the maize, the corn cultivation area, the area of horticulture. And towards the end of the class today, we'll be moving up into Canada and be starting to see some people who are hunter-gatherers rather than corn horticulturalists. So they raised corn in village gardens. And as with the Powhatan people that we looked at in Virginia, the women were the principal workers in the gardens. They were the principal horticulturists. And they, like the people in the central and northern East Coast and around the Great Lakes and through most of what's now Canada, spoke a language in the Algonquian language group, indicating, if you go back further than it's possible to go with any certainty, probably some common origins. And the Powhatan people that we saw down here along the Chesapeake Bay, about the southernmost limit of the Algonquian language group. Before we get into the Puritans further, I should mention that if you're ever in eastern Massachusetts, Plimoth Plantation, just outside of Plymouth, spelt the original way with an I rather than a Y, Plimoth Plantation is well worth a visit. My wife Dana and I spent the better part of a day there a few years ago, and we both agreed that it's generally very well done, including its recognition of the presence, the importance of, and the culture of the Wampanoags. And if you do get by Plimoth Plantation, of course, keep in mind that Plymouth was much the lesser in terms of population, 10 years earlier, but much the lesser of the Puritan settlements in New England. It maintained, Plymouth colony maintained separate independence through most of the 17th century, and towards the end of the 17th century disappears, absorbed by Massachusetts Bay. Okay, why were the Puritans turning up in Massachusetts? What did they want? And actually, it's worth mentioning here that it's Plymouth, Boston, or Massachusetts Bay Colony, and subsequently Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire as well. Vermont came later. And as we'll mention in passing, Rhode Island, a New England sewer colony, so-called, was kind of a special case. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay. At the beginning, in the early years of the 17th century, I think the Puritan leaders, and early on, the first generation, a large majority of the rank and file were after a model Christian community, a model Christian community that would serve as a model for first England, the power, the major power, and then the entire world. The Puritans almost invariably came in family groups. The Puritans believed that God had selected England to lead the world to the millennium, to the Christian millennium, and that God intended them to serve as a shining example for England to follow. You can imagine their excitement when a few years after the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay, the English Civil Wars broke out. They were hoping for the best. Instead, they got Oliver Cromwell, but that's another story. So the thing to keep in mind is that they had a rather exalted opinion of their own importance. As one historian has said, they saw all of history as a prologue to New England. Speaking of self-importance. So their interest was focused, first of all, inwardly on themselves. How are we doing in identifying and following God's plan? After that, on events in England and what effect they were having on the religious, theological, and political situation in England. So their reason for coming, unlike that of the Virginia colonists, was essentially religious. Indeed, I think the Puritan period was certainly the only time in American history that a body of Europeans who controlled such a large segment of the country were themselves controlled by a religious impulse of anything like the all-encompassing power of the Indian belief, the Native American belief, that religion was the very fabric of life. Spiritualism was the very fabric of life. So in that respect, the Indians and the Puritans had a lot in common. They both took the spiritual world very, very seriously. But their religious systems were mutually exclusive. The Puritans believed in the Christian, single, jealous, all-power, all-seeing God, monotheism. They believed that only that God and human beings had a soul. They believed in a divine plan for progress toward the Christian millennium, a plan that on both the individual and collective levels could somehow be influenced by human beliefs and human behavior. In other words, you by your behavior could influence God's plan. And again, they were there to serve as the spearhead of that plan. The New England Native people, on the other hand, like the Pueblo people and the people of the Powhatan Confederacy, believed that everything had a soul. They believed in no such thing as a single, omnipotent, omniscient God, but in a degree of spirit, of soul, in everything. They did not believe in a divine plan moving toward any particular divinely ordained goal, but in the continual, intimate, personal involvement of a multitude of spirits in the everyday personal and tribal life of everyone. They believed to varying degrees that time was more cyclical than linear. Christianity, with the idea of the second coming of Christ, the idea of a millennium, you have the idea of a linear, a progression of history. Things are moving along. Things are changing. Things are going to change. Things are going to continue to change. And eventually will come the Christian millennium. Native people, if they thought in terms of the passage of time, I think had a cyclical, a recurring image of time. The way of life will continue. The spirits, provided we work with them, will hopefully continue to work with us. And Gil Nichols, in his Wednesday morning class, has gone into a lot of very useful detail regarding Indigenous spiritualism, as those of you who are in his class realize. Okay, in the last 60, 70 years or so, there's been a big and sometimes bad-tempered debate on how the Puritans treated the Indians. If you read historians of Puritan-Indian relations going back to the 1940s and 50s and down to the present, historians have usually agreed that the end result was disastrous for the New England natives. But the question they've asked is, did the Puritans try to be fair? Some have argued, yes, by their lights. Others have said, rather, that Puritans were sanctimonious, lying, land grabbing, hypocritical. You can fill in a number of profane terms after that. So let's spend a few minutes looking at that. And since the Puritans had such a high moral opinion of themselves and of the importance of their mission, what did they think they were doing with the native people in their relations? Well, there wasn't any real concerted effort to convert Indians until pressure was brought by the British government in England in the years after the initial settlement. Again, the Puritan concern was first and foremost for the spiritual integrity of Christian people themselves. Their ministers were chiefly concerned with the rather convoluted process of finding evidence that God had chosen a certain person, which was a process that was only accomplished over a long period of time. usually years, and done in the case of each individual. So the ministers were preoccupied with their own English people. Unlike the Spanish Catholics who accepted the word and church going of a Spaniard that he or she was a Catholic, the Puritan clergy had to have proof that you were a converted Christian. Otherwise, they wouldn't just take your word for it. And the same applied to the praying Indians, what we call the praying Indians that were Christianized in a scattering of small praying Indian villages. Some of the native people, the Wampanoags, the Massachusetts, Nauset, whatever, had to apply 2 or 3 times or more before they could convince the minister that they had indeed had a conversion experience and were presumed worthy of membership in the church. Some historians have declared that the Indians could simply have declared themselves believers, but I don't believe that that was the case. So in most respects, Puritans saw Indians somewhat as they saw the non-Puritan Europeans, whites, among them, as people who, if they had not been chosen by God for salvation, should at least be put under proper civil government. And they too had been influenced by the novel Utopia, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, and the utopian idea of virtue gives you authority to impose your authority over people who are less virtuous than yourselves. But in any case, neither Indians nor the white strangers, the European strangers, fishermen, traders, people who were just there for the hell of it, people who were there by accident because they'd managed to find their way ashore from a wrecked ship, people who had not come to join the Puritans consciously. White strangers and native people could not be allowed to interfere with the proper process of the holy experiment. Consequently, troublesome strangers, either simply because they were violent, because they were non-cooperative, or because they were theologically difficult, like Anne Hutchinson and other people, men and women, who theologically tangled with the Puritan establishment, they were booted out to Rhode Island. Rhode Island found it as a sort of place to shuffle people who weren't worthy of remaining in the Bay Colony or in Plymouth, place for them to go. One historian I recall working with had argued that the British colonies throughout the eastern seaboard had what he called sewer colonies, that there was a neighboring colony that people in this case, Massachusetts, could push people out to when they wanted to get rid of them. For New England, it was Rhode Island. For Virginia and South Carolina, it was North Carolina. For New York, it was New Jersey, and so on. Not necessarily a terribly, well, point worth talking about historically, the idea of sewer colonies. Okay, Indigenous people in New England. In 1600, there were probably about 70,000 to 100,000 native people in all of New England, in what's now the 6 New England states. By 1620, down to about 50,000 or thereabouts after the plague of 1616, 1617 largely decimated the Massachusetts Indians. It's worth mentioning parenthetically that, as with native populations throughout the hemisphere, estimates have been on the average rising in the last 60, 70 years. 20, 25 years ago, I was saying that the post-plague population of New England was probably around 25,000. Now it looks more likely to be around 50,000. Okay, let's open it up for some quick questions here before we get into more detail about the Northeast Native people. Any comments, questions on what I've had to say so far about the Pilgrims and the Puritans? Laura, can you open it up?
Absolutely. Remember that you can unmute yourself. If you have trouble with that, reach out to me in the chat box.
I'd forgotten about the plague. What was the plague? Was it smallpox or?
Probably,
Okay.
probably. It was before there were there was before any significant European settlement in the area. So far as we can tell, it was probably smallpox. There's one or two other possibilities that I don't recall, but it was probably smallpox. 1616, 1617 was a scattering of fisher people, whalers, people calling to trade with the local Indians. But so we're not sure. Probably smallpox, Judy.
Thank you.
My usual long-winded answer.
No, it's okay. Anything else?
Other
Anything?
questions for Alan?
Alan, do you know what Anne Hutchinson's problem with them was about? What she disagreed with them on?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Alice?
Do you know what Anne Hutchinson's problem with them, why she was booted out? Anne Hutchinson?
Who to go to Rhode Island?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, with Anne Hutchinson, she was not only theologically troublesome, but she was a woman in a field that women were not supposed to really pay much attention to. She and oh gosh, Laura, do you remember the name of the instructor who did the course on the antinomian controversy?
I do not. I apologize.
Should remember because I sat in on it. But in any case, yeah, there were wherever you take your theology really seriously, if you get heretics, if you get people who don't follow the theological line, however it's going, we either want to get rid of them one way or the other. And Anne Hutchinson had the problem of being both theologically troublesome. She argued theology with the clergy, but she was also a woman. So if you were theologically troublesome, or if you were tended to be violent and lawless, a number of strangers, a number of non-Puritan people also were encouraged to go to Rhode Island, where they didn't necessarily find things were any better for them, because Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, also took his theology, his religion seriously, but in a different way. Does that help, Alice?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, well, let's get back to it and go to the culture area, the Northeast. The various tribes in the Northeast culture area, tribes and in some cases confederations. Down here, our old friends, the Powhatan, Massachusetts, extending up into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, what's now southern Quebec and southern Ontario, all the way west to the Ojibwe, who we used to call the Chippewa, the Ojibwe, out here to the Illinois and around here, right around the Great Lakes in the Northeast. And yes, along with the Powhatans, the Massachusetts and the other people of the New England area, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and so on, part of this Northeast culture area. In warfare, always important to consider that when we're looking at people, New England native warfare was much like that of the Virginia tribes. Intermittent, largely concerned with tribal honor and personal honor, with captive catching, fairly common, or sometimes warfare over trespassing on tribal hunting or fishing or agricultural land. We'll be getting on to more detailed warfare and more institutionalized warfare, well, not today, but perhaps in the future when we get to the Iroquois. Okay, I've said there could be violence, warfare over trespass on tribal lands. And what do I mean by tribal lands? Well, the Puritans, like most Europeans, believed that there was justification, moral and legal, for occupying the land of another people if that land was apparently being wasted. Utopia again, Sir Thomas More's Utopia. And to the Puritans, the Native Americans' land appeared to be being wasted, particularly with the post-plague thinned population in eastern Massachusetts. Many of the Puritans, perhaps most, believed that while individual Indians may well be worth civilizing and trying to Christianize, native tribal entities, indigenous nations, were hard to pin down as governments, as they were used to thinking of governments. They kept looking for someone in authority, someone with the power to make enforceable policy decisions, like European kings or parliaments. They tended to underestimate the influence of the New England sachems, who ruled by consensus and persuasion. And at this point, it's also worth pointing out the distinction between warriors and soldiers, which I believe I've done in other context. The Native Americans throughout North America, they're fighting people who were very good indeed, for the most part, were warriors. That is, they went into war not because they were commanded to do so by a hierarchy of command, but by a process of consensus and persuasion. And in many, many cases, if you decided you didn't want to follow a specific military leader, then you wouldn't. And that'll be okay. You'd find somebody else to follow. whereas soldiers who fit into a complex and rather rigid hierarchy, soldiers damn well do as they're told or else. And perhaps needless to say, the Europeans, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, and others had soldiers. North American native people had warriors. And in the hemisphere, the only exception to this generalization that I'm aware of are the Inca. They had soldiers. But we're not dealing with them in this course. In this course, we're dealing with sachems who ruled by consensus and persuasion. The Puritans also believed, as did all American colonial and later governments, in government regulation of transfer of Indian lands in order to avoid unnecessary frontier violence. Remember Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, Governor Berkeley versus Nathaniel Bacon. You want to regulate property transfers to enforce, some people at least believed, at least a modicum of justice, European justice, in the acquisition of land occupied by Indians. A 1635 Massachusetts Bay Colony law officially ended land purchases from Indians by individuals. In theory, at least, from then on, only the government, only the colonial government could buy or otherwise acquire land from local Indians. Okay, European land tenure, or I should say British land tenure, and Native American land tenure, different. The Indians felt that their tribe, the people, held collectively together the hunting, fishing, and agricultural rights over the land they occupied. Members of friendly tribes were usually welcome to live for a time on tribal land, which was not otherwise being used. Friendly tribesmen passing through for trading or raiding purposes were usually welcome. But the idea of individual ownership just didn't exist. Indian land tenure, to generalize, was a lot more flexible than European and specifically British was. The idea of holding land in fee simple. This is my land, I bought it, I paid for it, it's mine, you can't stray onto it without my permission. The idea of land property being held in fee simple. Very important, emerging very important in England at the time, and needless to say, very important in the United States today. Okay, again, with the number of Indians down due to diseases, there was quite a bit of land available. And with their numbers down, the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag Indians saw Puritans as allies against other tribes, like the Narragansett, the Nipmuc in here, the Mohican down in this corner, Mohegan and Mohican, different tribes, similar names. So if you suffer a steep population drop off, as the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts had, you're apt to look for allies, and if worst comes to worst, perhaps allies amongst the incoming English settlers. Okay, so in many places in eastern Massachusetts, there was little friction for a while. And in Puritan Massachusetts, you didn't get the constant violence that you got at the start in Virginia, where due to a lack of epidemics in early Virginia, there was a denser native population. But predictably, perhaps, as the number and prosperity of Puritan colonists increased, there was more friction. The Puritans, like the Virginians, tried to keep guns out of natives' hands, but with limited success. There were often strangers, commercial traders, fishermen on the coast and so on, who were more than happy to sell the local native people guns. So you began to get guns and other European trading goods, horticultural instruments, iron hoes, and so on coming in. And you did have some amicable land purchases, land dealings early on, although it's safe to say that the Indians really had no solid concept of the English idea of land ownership. This is my land, my property. Once I buy it from you, you have no further right on it, period. And it's worth emphasizing the distinction between custody and ownership here. For the native people, they had collective custody of the tribal lands. It wasn't individual proprietorship. It wasn't individual ownership. It was a collective custody. And if you needed a little more land because your family was growing and you needed a little more gardening land, well, okay. There was some available somewhere in the tribal territory. And for hunting and fishing, well, everybody shared and shared alike. Okay, in New England, as in Virginia, eventually the numbers of colonists began to grow larger and faster than Indians at first must have imagined that they would. In New England, unlike in Virginia, the fishermen, the coastal fishermen since the late 15th century, been there since shortly after the time of Columbus. They made the local native people accustomed to small numbers of Europeans showing up, trading, getting along pretty well. So it took a while for the local people to begin to worry. But eventually, inevitably, worry they did. And in the Pequot War of 1637, the Puritans showed they'd brook no organized opposition from the Indians. There were about 3,000 Pequot down here in eastern Connecticut, what's now eastern Connecticut. They were a relatively aggressive tribe, and they seemed on their way to becoming dominant in what is now Connecticut. And it may be, it seemed to the Metacom, the Narragansett, some of the Niantic people, that they seem to be aiming for dominance in southern New England, perhaps something like the sort of hegemony which the Pamunkey, Powhatan hegemony, which the Pamunkey enjoyed on the Virginia coast. And the Puritans weren't about to have, the English settlers weren't about to have a strong, dominant tribe that could conceivably challenge them for possession of the land. Neither, for that matter, were the other major local tribes. The Narragansett and the Mohegans joined the Puritans as allies. Also, the New Englanders, which now included Connecticut colony, weren't happy with the Dutch, now inhabited New York, far western, rather, Long Island, what's now New York City, Manhattan, and beginning to move up the Hudson River Valley from New Amsterdam, New York City, for fur trading. And perhaps looking ahead, they might have been moving into Western Connecticut, dealing with the native people there and doing some trading and settling there. So the New Englanders weren't particularly happy with the Dutch. And it was the usual complex situation that leads up to wars, but basically the people, the colonies of Connecticut, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay decided it was time to take action. There were triggering incidents. There was the murder of a ship's crew by the Pequot, and you got a joint Massachusetts and Connecticut expedition into Pequot country to, in effect, demand submission. The Pequot refused, and a war followed, featuring a savage massacre of Indians in their fortified town here at what's now Mystic, Connecticut. The militias, and this is all involving colonial militia, not regular British troops. The militia torched the town, the fortified town, and refused to let any Pequot people, men, women, or children, out as the fire raged. So not a bright chapter in New England Indian relations, and demonstrating irrefutably that the colonists would brook no substantial organized opposition from native people. And while we're talking about warfare, keep in mind that the Powhatans, the Wampanoags, and others had been awed at first by European ships, guns, and metal, especially those huge ships, by canoe standards, huge ships. But they would have been equally impressed, and keep this in mind, they would have been equally impressed if they could have seen an Inca fortress in South America, or an Aztec pyramid, or a Mayan astronomical calculation. So that's parenthetical, but worth keeping in mind. Okay, after the Pequot War, the colonists' numbers continued to grow rapidly and more rapidly. By 1675, there were some 50,000 Europeans in New England, southern New England, and probably less than 30,000 native people. The Wampanoag tribe back in Massachusetts had been closely tied to the English of Plymouth colony, as we've discussed, from 1620. But there was now a man named Metacom. He was now the sachem of the Wampanoags, and he was worried. he built an offensive alliance of central New England Indians against the English. You'll recall that Opechancanough down in Virginia had become extremely concerned too, and that led to warfare against the colonists. In New England, the result was Metacom's War, or King Philip's War, to use the name the colonists gave him. They assumed he was something like a king rather than a sachem. Okay, in Metacom's War, the Indians split. About 6,000 or 8,000 of the southern New England native people went with Metacom, and about 5,000 were allies of the colonists. Metacom's War and that Second Anglo-Powhatan War in 1622 in Virginia, by the way, were the two bloodiest wars in American history in terms of their effect on the white population. And Metacom's War, much later, was a much bigger event. A huge number of colonists, either militiamen or settlers, killed in Indian raids. After the war, after Metacom's War, got the first American veterans problem. The colonies having to make up their minds what to do about people who had been wounded or otherwise badly done serving in the militia. But the effect on the Wampanoags and all of the other indigenous people of New England was disastrous. And after 1675, after Metacom's War, all tribes in New England were eliminated as independent factors in the history of the region, as independent characters in the New England development drama. So 1675, definitely a watershed. And after 1675, after Metacom's War, I think we can identify 3 strategies for survival. You might call it strategies for survival for New England Indians. 1, you could take off and try to move north into New Hampshire, Maine, New Brunswick, flight to friendly tribes to the west and to the north, perhaps go west to the Mohegan, even to the Iroquois. Second strategy, mind your own business, become an inconspicuous enclave. And this worked for several towns in rural New England, including the town of Mashpee on Cape Cod, which well into the 20th century was a significantly different town, organized as a town under the laws of Massachusetts, but with a significant native presence. And indeed, the Mashpee people were briefly recognized, given federal recognition as a federally recognized tribe that within the last few months has been withdrawn, and who knows what will happen. But in any case, you could live quietly on the rural periphery of towns, often the countryside, small towns. And if you were lucky, could even get incorporated as a town, as Mashpee was, and perhaps be able to maintain some of your cultural distinctiveness. Third strategy, anglicize. Try to become Christian. As the population, the European immigrant, British population of New England became more varied, different religious denominations, Presbyterians in particular, later on Methodists and others, Baptists, became available, and they were less particular about who they accepted as converts than the Puritans had been. So you could anglicize. You could basically give up your indigenous person identity and try to blend into the British population as best you could. Okay, that's the barest outlines. It does seem that the Puritans made the effort to deal fairly with the Indians by their light. There's a few cases where whites were punished by courts for crimes against Indians. In 1638, a Plymouth colony executed 3 whites for the murder of an Indian. In Connecticut colony, some native people were acquitted in court of the murder of 9 white settlers. They were murdered, but the court decided not by this particular group of Indians. But there was never any question in the Puritan mind or in the mind of the Puritan successors that English jurisprudence should prevail, or that Indian war captives could be sold into slavery, as we've already discussed. In the Puritan mind, there was always some doubt as to how well their city upon a hill, their example for England and the world to follow, was succeeding. Many of them saw Metacom's War in 1675 as a chastening by God for their failures. But they never doubted that their way, even if flawed, was infinitely favorable, infinitely superior to the devilish Indian way of life. The Indians were still expected to recognize the superiority of English church and state, and when they didn't, it was a sign of satanic influence. There weren't the numbers of Puritans running away to the Indians as there had been of settlers in Virginia, although when they did run, and some did, the Puritans usually said, good riddance. If they didn't want to go to Rhode Island, they could go off and live with the native people. Dissenters were best booted out of the New Israel. And while I didn't put it on the bibliography that Laurie sent around this past week, there's a good, I think very good, Nathaniel Hawthorne short story, Young Goodman Brown. And as I say, it's not on the bibliography or in any of the handouts, but if you can come across a collection of Nathaniel Hawthorne short stories, it's worth reading Young Goodman Brown for a, I think, graphic literary image of the idea that the Puritans had of the Indians. Young Goodman Brown. If I were assigning readings, I'd assign that. Okay, at this point, any further comments, questions?
Remember, you have to unmute yourself, or you can type your question in the chat box and I can relay it for you.
Alan, I'm wondering why there wasn't a more aggressive effort on the part of the Puritans to teach Christianity to the Indians. Did they just think they were beneath that they weren't really human? I mean, it didn't seem to me that there was much of an effort at all.
No, they thought they were human, all right, but they thought they were children of the devil. And I think with the first generations, now later on, when you get different Christian denominations coming in, when you get the Baptists coming in, particularly more missionary-minded, you do begin to get more systematic efforts. And there was some systematic effort. A man named John Eliot, so-called the Good Apostle Eliot, spearheaded the establishment of praying Indian towns. And there were others, usually pushed by institutions, the Church of England, back in England. So you did get a certain amount of this, but I think it's very hard to overestimate the Puritans' sense of self-importance. And again, take a look at, if you have a chance, read young Goodman Brown with where the wayward Puritans go to commune with the devil. And something else to keep in mind, Dawn, with the exception of a few fringe denominations, it wasn't until the late 18th century that you began to get a really big, systematic Protestant missionary attempt. Protestant missionary movement, beginning in England in the 1780s and 90s, and then quickly spreading to the United States. That's a whole different topic.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah, Gil.
Do you happen to have the date on John Eliot handy there?
You know, I don't have any references to Eliot. I can mention parenthetically that I went to the school he supposedly founded for 1 year when I was in the 7th grade. It's now Roxbury Latin School, and the school song included the reference to the Good Apostle Eliot. And I've read bits and pieces on him, but never really anything systematic.
Uh-huh.
You know, one of those things I should look at and really haven't.
One of the interesting kind of side comments is the different in the approach of the Jesuits compared to the the Protestant attempts to Christianize. The Jesuits being taking a very different approach as comparison.
Oh yeah, yeah, and you know, just the history and details of Christian missions, particularly the different flavors of Christianity among the native people. We'll be talking a bit more about that when we get to the Jesuits in Canada, the Jesuits among the Huron, and so on.
Right.
We already talked a bit about it with the Pueblo people, but yeah, the colonists, I think, in the 17th century, for the most part, were the ones who were deeply religious, were more concerned with maintaining their religiosity in the challenging environment of the wilderness. You don't want people, the Virginians didn't want people to run away physically to the native people. The Puritans didn't want people to run away spiritually and you want to have people continuing to toe the party line. Anything else?
What, Alan, what, other than the Mashpee, what remnants of tribes are there today in New England? I know there's a tribe that has the big casino in Connecticut. And
Oh, yes, yeah, that's a whole story in itself. Yeah.
so there,
Most of them now are up in Maine. The Passamaquoddy, offhand, I can't think of any of the others that have specific entities. Most of them, while they held out for a while in central or western Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, eventually were dissolved. Now, it's also worth mentioning that they didn't dissolve themselves to the extent that they lost all sense of their tribal heritage. And I'm bound to say that particularly since the Indian gaming law of 35, 40 odd years ago, that enabled the establishment of tribal casinos on reservations, like the one in Connecticut. There's been a considerable scrambling to gain federal recognition on the part of several New England tribes, including in eastern Massachusetts. But yeah, the Passamaquoddy up in Maine is the only other one I can think of. That's a good question. I wish I could answer it in more detail. Anything else? Okay, let's get back to a brief, very quick review of what we've done so far. With the Virginia settlements, you'll recall, we argued that there was a rather fluid beginning racially with the attitudes of English settlers towards Indians and slaves, who were sometimes Indians, sometimes West Africans, and white indentured servants, Native people, West Africans, white indentured servants. Early on in Virginia, you'll recall, I emphasized that the attitudes weren't set in concrete, with the thinly scattered English population mixed about. But then after Bacon's rebellion later in the century, the Virginia colony began to settle into the classic Southern American plantation slave society pattern. I said I believed that after the rebellion of the lower class whites of the colony, led by Bacon, the Virginia aristocracy came to fear a lower class white rising more than one by slaves, certainly by Indians. Black slaves and any remaining Indians were, after Bacon's rebellion, kept firmly at the bottom of the social and economic order, with the lower class whites, beginning of the Southern rednecks, clearly above them. And these relationships, along with the Puritan religious attitudes of religious and cultural superiority, tended to set American social, economic, and to a considerable extent emotional patterns until well into the 20th century, and I think we could certainly argue right up to the present. And in the process, Indian land dispossession, already common and justified to most colonists, came to seem more and more the natural right of the colonists, just as to more and more colonists, slavery came to to seem to be the natural lot of blacks. Then we moved to New England and the Puritans. The Puritans being an offshoot of the great Protestant religious fermentation of the late 16th and first 3/4 of the 17th century. And in New England, they saw themselves as a beacon upon a hill, with their strong attitudes being extended to Native Americans as well as to the British strangers among them. The idea of any conversion being by example and teaching only, and never taking the word of a convert that he or she had been properly converted. So the Indians, again, being seen much as the non-Puritans among them, as being probably not saved by God, but obliged to submit to the Puritans' godly government for their own and the world's good. And I think you can see some echoes of this in American foreign policy. Both strangers and Indians must conform to Christian policy. So in New England, inevitable conflict, even sharper than in Virginia, where land hunger was the main spur of frontier behavior. In New England, the Puritans were so self-important, convinced that there was only one true government, one true social system, one true faith in the world, and they were the closest to it. The only problem they saw was the proper interpretation of the Word of God as laid down in the Bible. And with the Indigenous people, natural behavior being in tune with their relationship to the spirit world, which was all around them and in countless different forms. And I think that this relationship, many Indians would argue, was often a somewhat different thing for different tribes and even for different individuals who could have varying relationships with particular spirits. This was such a world apart from the Christian and particularly the narrowly focused monotheistic Puritan Christian world that there often seemed to be little in common between the two. But still, again, despite the shocking differences, one parallel, both Puritan and Indian lives revolved around their respective faiths. One built around a distant, single, jealous Christian God. The other around a complex of much more familiar personal spirits. Now, the Puritans were preeminently the people of the book. The Indians were the people of a nature which was divine in 1,000 different ways. One further complication of the situation in New England, a lot of small colonies in a small place. Massachusetts, Plymouth until 1691, a separate colony. Connecticut, New Haven colony, separate for a while. New Hampshire, and the New England pariah, Rhode Island. And understandably, the Indians didn't understand the differences between the English colonies, the jealousies and the religious and commercial rivalries, any more than the English usually appreciated native tribal differences. In New England, there was friction from theological quarrels between the colonies, as well as personal and territorial rivals. There was the confusing spectacle of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Plymouth, all arguing about who had, quote, jurisdiction, unquote, over the Narragansett. And in Metacom's war, to complicate things, the governor of New York, the English colony in New York, invaded Connecticut for New England territorial, for New York's territorial claims. So the politics getting complicated as well. And as I've already mentioned, intra-Protestant rivals, Anglicans, Puritans, Quakers, Presbyterians. After 1660, England was officially Anglican, Episcopal, Church of England again. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. But if you were a Scottish immigrant, and there were quite a few of them coming in, Scotland was officially Presbyterian. Very different from New Mexico, where theologically the Roman Catholics were all identical, even though there was a certain amount of jealousy, competition between the regular and the secular clergy. Okay, in the last 10 minutes or so of the class, let's just take a leap to the north and spend a few minutes looking at what would be the next segment of the Indians in North America to 1815, of course. And this useful map, European arrivals in North America. And we've seen maps like this, similar to this before. Spanish mining, silver mining down here in central Mexico. Spanish expansion coming up here with missions and up the California coast, largely to defend the worthwhile Spanish establishment for them, their point of view, in Mexico. Spanish moving into Florida. Briefly, a Swedish claim to Delaware, what's now Delaware. Dutch fur trade, New Amsterdam, briefly. But after the British got rid of the Dutch and the Swedes, the British colonies here in the eastern seaboard, extending down eventually in the 18th century, moving into what's now Georgia, the Georgia colony, and moving as far west as the Appalachian Mountains. Fisheries going back centuries, from Brittany, from parts of England, fishing stations, Nova Scotia, coast of Maine, coast of New Brunswick, coast of Newfoundland, and the French expansion that we'll begin to talk about now, moving up the St. Lawrence Valley towards the Great Lakes and what became Quebec. And somewhat later, very important for the northern native people in North America, the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade. And also much later, Russians coming down from Siberia with fur trade there. Okay, the French specifically, haven't talked about them yet. They get into the colony business in the early 17th century, about the same time as the English. Well, why were they so late? Well, there were civil wars in France, not settled until the 1690s. But France, as you know, was not really stuck out into the Atlantic. The Spanish and the Portuguese out there in the Iberian Peninsula stuck out there into the Atlantic with some handy islands like the Canaries to expand into. The British, with the British Isles and surrounding islands, had a strong seafaring tradition going way, way back. But the French didn't really have any Atlantic islands to practice on. There were none handy. And the French in the center of Western Europe saw themselves as the great European land power. The Dutch, who also got into the business at about the same time, here in New Amsterdam, and with much more enduring consequence in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and South Africa, much later. The Dutch had long-standing seafaring experience by the 16th century and were becoming accustomed to organizing shipping ventures around the world. The Dutch Empire was always mainly commercial, not large numbers of settlers except in South Africa. So they had the background experience for their sort of colonialism. But the poor French, they didn't have the Iberian stuck out into the Atlantic experience of the Spanish and Portuguese. They didn't have the English seagoing heritage or the Dutch seagoing and commercial heritage. But by the 17th century, the French were the strongest land power in Europe and beginning to feel rather badly that they were lagging in the empire business, especially as the upstart Dutch, who were upstarts and Protestants to boot, were beginning to build a thriving commercial empire. As with the Spanish and Portuguese rivalry, never underestimate the importance of keeping up with the Joneses in international affairs. If you look on yourself as the major European power, major unified European kingdom, as the French did, you want to be in the top of the heap for everything, including moving overseas. So you move overseas. Keep up with the Joneses. Very important in international relations. Okay, so for national honor, to make money like the Dutch were doing, the French moved out. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain, after whom Lake Champlain is named in northwestern Vermont, after which Samuel Champlain established the first permanent French settlements in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Previously, there had been the fishing brief settlements, mostly British and some Basque people along the coast. But in 1608, the French monarchy sent Champlain to establish permanent settlements in the St. Lawrence Valley, adjoining Iroquois villages. And here is the Iroquois world here: Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. There had been some French fur trading contact a bit up the St. Lawrence earlier. So the Indians weren't shocked. They'd seen European explorers. They'd seen some early French individual fur traders coming up the St. Lawrence Valley. So they knew a bit about the Europeans. And this, Montreal, Quebec, communities, the settlements that became Montreal and Quebec, were the beginnings of what would become French Quebec, later the Canadian province of that name. Okay. Again, the French and still some very British fishing, you can't say settlements, but stations in the maritime, Canadian maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island here, and New Brunswick, and also some fishing settlements up here in Newfoundland, which was often a world of its own and probably always will be. Okay, though the French and the British had established prosperous fur trading stations, let me back up a little bit. Make a change to my notes here. Throughout the 17th century, the British and the French, throughout the 17th century, the British and the French had been establishing what became prosperous trading stations, what they called factories in India. And with the French, the regular clergy, the Franciscans, then the Jesuits, began tagging along in the St. Lawrence Valley, carrying missions with them, activated by the spirit of the Counter-Reformation, trying to counter Protestant inroads in the New World. And the Jesuits and the Franciscans came to Canada and began working, missionizing on the Indians, much as Catholic missions had settled in down here among the Pueblo people. Okay, we're nearing the end of our time, and of course this is also the last class of the course. So let's call it quits there with that very brief lead-in to French expansion in what became the French province of Quebec, and early French contacts with the Iroquois along the St. Lawrence, with the Algonquian tribes up here, and eventually with the Huron and the Tobacco people down here. We've got to let it go at that. And Lori, if you would open up for a final group of questions, then let's go.
Remember, you need to unmute yourself to ask your question or type it in the chat box and I will assist.
I'm hooked and I'm looking forward to the next class.
Well, you have to.
It's a cliffhanger. You've done a great job.
Yeah, the next class, assuming there is one, and that's up to the curriculum committee and so on, but if there's a next class, it would deal, well, with the coming of the French fur traders, the missions to the Huron people, the arrival of the Hudson Bay Company fur traders coming in here, and then the American Revolution. We'd spent some time with the Iroquois. The Iroquois, terribly important. The Iroquois Confederation, a singularly successful political and military confederation of 5, later 6 tribes that managed to very effectively play off the British and the French against each other, maintaining a independent existence right up to the American Revolution. And then eventually, hopefully we'd get down to 1815, which I think is the last period when it was remotely, and it would have been remote by then, remotely possible for there to be an independent Native American presence in North America.
Oh, okay.
It looks like the French, from the prior map you had up there, it looks like the French settled New Orleans from the north. I always assumed they had settled New Orleans from the sea, but rather it looks like from the land. So they came down Quebec, down the Mississippi Valley, and into the New Orleans area. I guess on their way, founding a little trading post called Kansas City.
Mhm.
Well, of course, the Spanish were down here in the West Indies, and the French were certainly there too, but the procedure from 1609 on was, yes, down the Mississippi, through the Great Lakes, Father Marquette, people like that, coming down the Illinois River. There's the Illinois River down here, traveling overland down the Ohio River, St. Louis. And yes, they did indeed establish St. Louis as a major port, New Orleans rather as a major port. So yeah, fascinating story.
Yeah.
Coming from, I grew up in South Dakota, and I know that the Sioux, or the Lakota, principally well, I would say the Lakota and maybe the Dakota, had a lot of, there are a lot of French last names among the people in the Dakotas, including probably the Turtle Mountain Chippewa that live up in North Dakota. But so many of them had obviously had some back in the 1800s, maybe 1700s, that had relationships with the traders, French traders.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, Andrea. Had relationships. I'd emphasized with the Spanish that few Spanish women came to New Spain, and the French also had a problem with getting women, and for that matter, large numbers of men, any settlers, to come to New France, to come to Quebec. And in what would be the next segment, we'd get into the courriers de bois, the runners into the woods, the French fur traders who moved, well, down along these arrows, and they were 1 or 2 or 3 men, not threatening. They got on generally very, very well with the native people, including into Minnesota, Wisconsin. Yes, by the 18th, well into the 18th centuries, up into what's now the Dakotas. And well, right here in Kansas City, the Choteau name. But yeah, you would find that throughout not just the Mississippi Valley, but the northern Midwest. The French courriers de bois, the fur traders, were interested in furs, and not surprisingly, also interested in women. And there was a good deal of the development of relationships and people of mixed heritage. Even in South Dakota.
Alan, do you know why the Puritans died out? I know they came supposedly for religious freedom and they brought all of their punitive measures with them. Did it just lose its appeal?
I'm sorry, did they what?
The Puritans came to America for religious freedom, but they brought so many of their punitive ways with them
to their own people. And so many expectations, you know, for spending so many hours in church every day. And then, like you
Yeah.
said, like the spike through the tongue and nailing someone's ear to the barn wall. Did Puritanism just die out because it lost its appeal because it was so punitive?
Yeah, yeah, punitive. Yeah, they weren't going to kill you usually, although the notorious Salem witch trials of later in the century, but by then, and that kind of a singular case. Yeah, they were a narrow and intolerant bunch. They are you looking into the origins of democracy, freedom?
Well, I was just interested in why that whole religion just kind of died out, because my ancestors were Puritans that came to America in 1630 and settled in Connecticut. And I was just curious, like how that whole religion just kind of just ended.
Yeah, well, today the spiritual descendants of the Puritans are the Congregationalists, or the United Church of Christ. And by the late 18th century, they had, I don't know, theologically evolved, I suppose would be the term, to, instead of being very narrow-minded, they had become much more broad-minded. By the time I was raised in a Congregational church in the 1940s and 50s, they were very easy, very light on theology, and very big into social work, very, very big into doing social good works, that sort of thing. The social gospel, as it was called. And actually, by the late 18th century, they'd become, they'd become theologically broad enough that the Unitarians split off from them. They gave birth to the Unitarian movement in the late 18th, early 19th century, what's now the Unitarian Universalist church. So the theological history of the Puritans, Congregationalists, is really quite fascinating. And of course, we as Americans like to emphasize the idea that they came to the New England colonies for freedom of religion. Well, they had freedom of religion in the Netherlands, the Pilgrims did. And the Puritans, most of them stayed in England and fought the English Civil Wars, followed Cromwell. And for a time you had a Puritan commonwealth, as Cromwell called it, in England. Many of the New England, and I didn't get into this, some of the New England Puritans went back to England to fight in the Civil Wars, because for many of them, this is what they've been working for. I think after 1660, after the Restoration in England, and when Boston was becoming a commercially successful trading and business port, the theology began to rapidly diminish. And then after Metacom's war, kind of the last gasp of this theological exactitude, I suppose, would have been the Salem witch trials. And after that embarrassment, which by now the British, after the Restoration, the British government was trying to gained a little more control over the American colonies, you know, the British governor was appalled by these witch trials. And after about 1680s, after the 1680s, 1690s, well, we can't get into the, you know, there was the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, but by then the Congregationalists, the Puritans, had completely lost control of American religious development. A whole new class on that. So I'm sorry I can't give a more coherent answer to that question, but you know, without going
No,
through
thank you. That was interesting.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you much for not just your attendance, but your really good questions. And stay safe, take care, and thanks again to Laurie. And Gil, I'll see you tomorrow at your class.